guards any checks on the second rank. What's the plan, though, for white?
It's a very slow plan, but it probably involves getting the rook to the 5th rank, maybe rook to b1. It's not possible here, but trying to get that rook to like b5 and to g5. Because that, yeah, okay, so Jan is trying to disturb that rook a bit, but there's rook a5 here, actually. Right. So he can, but then maybe queen b2, king f3, queen b7, e4. It's hard to say. It starts to get sharp, but rook a5 looks like a very interesting move.
But that looks tough for black too. So if we just go with what Fabian was saying, rook a5, queen b2 check, king f3, queen b7 check. Now after e4, rook g5 check is like a pretty big threat with knight f5 to follow.
Yeah, and there's no b3.
And let's say like queen to b4, for example, or something to disturb the pieces, then rook to g5, king to f6.
Wait, which position?
Queen b4?
Here, queen b4, let's say. Rook g5, king f6, e5. King f7, you know, the king on e4 will, maybe doesn't go here immediately, but...
Feels so good, but there's queen b1. In a lot of these positions, you end up starting to play moves like this, like you want to block with the check. You want to keep the knight close to the king to avoid perpetual by the queen.
Right, which is why you can even keep your pawn on e4, just to shield all sorts of checks around. But it's a position
like
where...
Like knight f5 first.
Right.
It gets very concrete.
If you check, like knight e3, and now h5 is loose, and you see the eval bar going up, you make one check that looks normal, and all of a sudden you might drop your pawn. So
okay, rook a2 and queen h1 are on the board.
Okay, knight f3 seems likely.
Okay, rook a6 check first. But then the knight will go back to f3.
Right.
King f7 or g7 is met by knight f3. Guarding the checks.
Yeah, he's playing this slowly. He wants to gain time on the clock. He's going to play king somewhere, knight f3. Queen will go somewhere like b1. Then the rook will drop from d6 to d2.
Yeah, I was going to say, you put the rook here. Then the rook and knight are coordinated for defense. You can push the e-pawn safely.
This is a very, very slow... He might actually try to push that e-pawn by putting the rook on e2 and e4.
Yeah, I was going to say, if the rook's on e2 and the king's on g2 and the knight's on f3, you push the e-pawn. Very difficult to stop. You can even put the rook on e1 defended by the knight.
Yeah, then you'll get checks from second, so probably the rook on e2 is going to be necessary at some... a rook on the second will be necessary at some point. Slow jamming
it. Is it time to predict the result? Joshua Chamberlain, does he live?
I think this is 50-50 still.
Yeah.
It's still very unclear to me if white is actually has an objectively, large advantage, or if it's just practically super tough for black. But this is, aside from some of the moments where he was winning for one move, like there was that rook to c2 and knight to f4 that we pointed out, this is the best chance he's had all game.
Yeah,
aside from all game, all match.
All match.
All match, yeah.
All match.
Maybe in years.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but well, I guess in years, yes. If it's the first time in this match, then the last time we played a match was years ago. So you're right. But here, the point is that black has shuffling to do. You don't have h4 for black, and we're just discussing that might not even be helpful, but you don't have it available to you. And Fabiano said rook d6, rook d2.
Here it comes.
We're seeing all this because as long as white's king is shielded, then e4 becomes a possibility. And you could see even now, once the rook goes to d6, e4 becomes possible because the queen can't take on e4, knight g5 check. There are all sorts of knight forks that black has to be on the lookout for, and that's no fun. We usually say this in speed chess, in bullet in particular. Knights are great pieces. You have to watch out for forks. We're getting into blitz chess. They don't have much time. And every move is critical at this juncture for Jan Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces.
Well said. And of course, we're joking that it's been years, I guess, but it has been 5 years since a decisive game in the classical portion of the World Chess Championship. So if you're tuning in, one of the more than 100,000 on Twitch, more than 35,000 on YouTube, and thousands scattered through the other platforms for streaming too. Thanks for being with us, and you might be about to witness history.
Rook d5 is a funny move, because anyway, after queen a2, he has to go back to d2.
Yeah.
So we pretty much get the same position. Black can't do anything. Black has no active ideas, so he just waits and asks white, what do you do?
Well, there is something a bit funny here in these positions because after queen, the queen will come to a2, and we see Magnus laser focused here and about to rook e2, right? This is what we've been talking about, right? So the rook comes to e2. And now let's say you play queen e4 to try to stop white from playing pawn e4, if that's what you're afraid of. But queen e4, just to show this, like if you move your knight to d2 and you think, oh, I'll go queen h1 and try to check you, then the knight goes back to f3.
And
you don't have checks anymore, and then I can't push my pawn.
We've seen this dog and pony show before.
You can't stop that pawn from going up to e4 to e5 and potentially to e6. The question is, after e6, black will blockade it with the king. He'll play king to f8 to e8 or to e7. And how does white make progress there? And the downside of moving your e-pawn forward is that at the moment, black has no way to check the white king. Then black has queen b6 or c5, king g2, queen to c6. Black can start to harass the white king either with checks or with pins.
Right. And then I guess my thinking is that white king will go over to h2 to limit some of your checks. Maybe I'll put my knight on h4 and then go after h5 pawn. So I may be willing to give up my e-pawn to get your h-pawn, and then my remaining 2 pawns are unopposed. And
well,
I can
the other idea I was going to answer that question with is, depending on where the queen is, if she's being sufficiently sort of suppressed by the knight, you also have the f-pawn, depending on how concrete those lines are.
If you can get e5 and f5, that starts to look super dangerous.
Yeah.
The question is, can you actually get it? Because black will, after e5, maybe play queen to b1 to cover that f5 square. Black doesn't want to see both those pawns rolling for sure, because if white gets pawns on like e5, f6, then we're already talking about pawns that might be rolling on their own.
Right.
They barely even need the rook's help. And then knight to g5 coming, e6, suddenly we're talking about promoting pawns. So, okay, Jan is just trying to bother Magnus a bit by playing queen b6. White can play king to g2. Black will play like queen b5 and just try to annoy white with pushing that pawn forward, which is not so easy.
And this is move 92, queen b6 was played here. We're nearing the century mark. And queen b6 is quite annoying because e4 not possible, the pawn is pinned. If you start going king to g2, maybe the queen will start going after the rook with a queen a6 or queen b5.
That's what I was saying, rook e1. I mean, the rook's on e1, the knight guards it.
Yeah, but then after queen b2, you don't want to put your king on the first rank. You can do that. Maybe you will eventually get e4 if you play like that, but it's really not how you want to play this position.
What does this move rook c2 besides just
I
passing?
think he's preparing knight d4 and rook to c6 to try to cut off that king and prepare some knight f5 stuff. But he's just shuffling around. He's gaining time with every move. You see, he was down to under a minute.
Yep.
Now Magnus is at 4 minutes, 17 seconds. He can continue to gain time because black can't do anything, and black can only claim a draw after 50 moves without a pawn being pushed or a trade. So white has plenty of time.
That. Yep.
Yeah, it looks like queen b1 was played and then knight to d4.
Yep.
So the black queen probes, the knight goes to d4 to protect the rook. There are some knight f5 ideas as well that need to be considered. So we see the queen going to h1.
So I have a question. I don't know the answer to this. What is the longest game ever played in a world championship match?
Shout out to our daily trivia question. I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know that we had that question. But for those of you who played along, all you had to do was quote tweet your answer to today's question. I don't even know what the question was or the answer. It's been a very long day, and it will be worth it if we get a decisive result. If we don't, Robert's walking home.
That's fine for me. But the position that we're getting here, the queen is on h1.
Yep.
And the king went up to f6. So we see that black's king goes forward, which isn't that big of a deal right now. But if you could like play e3 to e5, that's when things get tricky because, as Fabiano said, pawns on e5 and f5 going together, they might roll themselves to the other side and become a queen. So e4 not possible right now because the queen takes e4, but that's the dream, is pushing the pawn to e5 in this position.
Yeah, once Nepo sees those pawns rolling,
it's over.
It's very dangerous for sure.
But maybe he's got the right defense going on. He's preventing e4, leaving queen h2 check. If you bring the knight back to f3, then the queen can just go back over to b1.
The queen should go back to b1 because let's say knight f3, if black were to play queen to d1, for example, I think white would happily take the chance to play e4 in that situation.
Yeah, because now there's no check here.
Now there's no check at all, and that pawn moves forward.
Are we about, is there like a 3-time repetition somewhere here?
I don't think
I don't think so because the king's on f6, but I'm just trying to keep track.
They're going to have to watch out for that for sure.
The knight wasn't on d4 previously.
Right, but if the knight goes back to f3. We've had positions with the queen on h1, the knight on f3, but the king on f6 and the rook on c6 look a bit different. Very easy to lose track of that, But Magnus will be very careful because he wants to play this until the very end, until the 50 move rule, if he gets that, or sorry, he starts pushing his pawn to restart the 50 move rule. For people who are watching who may not be so familiar, that if there are 50 moves made without a pawn push or a capture, the game concludes as a draw. So that's something to keep in mind as well, that at some point Magnus may have to make the move e4 or f5 to start the move counter over again.
There he is, Magnus Carlsen. His legacy is at stake. He wants to defend his title for the 4th time.
But Jan is defending this endgame extremely well.
Jan is defending this endgame incredibly well. I think that this is, frankly, if Jan holds this, it might be as telling in regards to what we'll be talking about in the World Championship as anything else, because this is the test. We know Magnus is going to get opportunities like this, and will Jan have the discipline and the perseverance to hold?
And it's a cool moment because e4 is possible now, because even if you could check and take the rook, there's a knight fork on e5. If you take the pawn on e4, there's knight g5 check. So neither the rook, which can't be attacked with check, or the pawn e4, which can be captured immediately, they're immune because of the knight forks. Now, we've been talking about if you play e4, you king gets susceptible to all sorts of other checks.
Yep.
But it feels like at some point or another, he'll have to play a pawn push.
Yeah, we should show it if e4 takes, just so everyone's aware. That's not a good idea.
Yeah, in this case, black will start to give checks, and white's king will be forced to the 1st rank, which it's not so clear if that's bad, but you probably don't want to go there.
I don't even know what to do.
I think you have to escape to the king side,
yeah,
king to g1 or something like that.
We have, okay, what do we have here? We have knight g5 check that has been played.
So what does Magnus want now? Because the knight on g5 doesn't attack anything there except for the king, gives a check. He could be preparing e4 and then trying to run his king through the middle of the board to create an attack using the king. But I don't see that really working out. So probably Jan will play king e7. I don't know if king g7 is also fine, but king e7 looks a bit more natural. Okay, king g7 also looks like a perfectly good move.
And the one benefit of having the king on g7 is to know rook h6, where not certain that the rook wanted to go there just yet, but we've been talking about this dynamic. If we trade e-pawn for h-pawn, that means that white has a little bit more freedom to try to push those pawns up the board. But here, the king's on g7. Where is it? It feels like white should be relatively close to be inching forward. I'm not even sure I see a move right now.
Yeah, I'm wondering about e4. And then I just want to run my king down e3, d4, e5, and try to create a mating net. Let's just see how that...
Oh, wow. You're just going to ditch the g3
I'm ditching
pawn?
the g3 pawn.
I like it.
I know that's very committal, but...
Okay, what's your line?
e4. Let's say queen to b2, king to e3, queen to b3, king to d4, and if queen g3, king to e5.
I like it.
Going all the way, trying to create a mating net using all the pieces.
You threatening things like king f5 in some positions, the rook goes to c7, and here you go.
Maybe even the previous move...
Start with rook c7.
Yeah, maybe the previous move wasn't accurate. Maybe rook to c7 first. Because if king to g6, there's f5. That wins.
Yes, it does.
Winning the queen and then promoting first. So, stuff like this could be possible, but it's tough.
He gives a check, which is smart just to gain time.
It looks like he's going back to d4 now, because after king f7, he's probably going... I mean, I don't think he wants to play knight g5 again. He might, but it looks like he's just trying to go to d4.
E4? Because you can never take this rook on c6. We talked about knight forks. There's a fork on d8 this time. And you can't take on e4 because there's a fork on g5. So this knight is such a tricky piece. He does go back to d4, which is sensible. It seems like he doesn't want to push until he's either forced to or he feels absolutely ready. But you can see Jan's chair shaking.
I wonder if he wants to play f5. Now, that looks like a really weird move. But let's say queen h1, f5. This actually allows the king to march up. In case of checks, queen h2, king f3, queen h1, king f4. Once the king gets active, we're talking about a mating attack. So it looks strange to try to move pawns together, right? e4, f5 slowly. But moving one pawn up is a bit unusual. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, queen h1 has been played, and as Robert observed, Jan's chair was shaking. That's the first time I think we've seen either player's chair shake in the entire match.
And you know that they're very nervous at this stage. Jan more so than Magnus. Magnus can't lose this position unless he blunders all
A
his
rook.
pieces, yeah, right. But here, it's a position where after Queen H1, the rook came back to F6. We have seen this position before.
He's going to give another
At
check
least
now.
once.
There's no advantage to having the king on F6 besides to give a check and gain.
Which means we've seen that position twice.
At least.
Yep.
Magnus will have to think about
Yeah, you have to
possible
be careful here.
threefolds. Yeah.
By the way, it's quite possible when we mention history, not only have we not had a decisive game in classical chess in 5 years, the longest game in World Championship history was Korchnoi versus Karpov in 1974, and it was 124 moves. For those of you following along at chess.com/events, one of our moderators can share a direct link to it. You can see we are on move 101. We'll keep you updated on the move number, but again, encourage everybody to go over to chess.com. You can still watch our show from the direct link. So if our staff can share some links, people can join us and watch over at chess.com/events.
I think unless we see a threefold repetition,
Yeah,
we
this is-
may
are
very
we
well break
about-
that record of the longest World Championship game.
Yeah. If Magnus wins this game, we are breaking that record.
For sure.
Yes.
Yeah. For sure.
Unless he, Jan blunders his queen, which is not going to happen.
Okay. I mean,
But there are some mating nets around this king, and I just want to show one sample line here. If you go e4 right now, you blunder queen b6 check, so that's clear. But
don't do that.
I'm just trying to make a point that if queen takes e4, like let's say you get e4 in and you take on e4, like rook f7 check can catch you really off guard, and now you're in trouble because king and this line. But if you also went king g6, there's f5 check, and if king h6, there's rook h7 check. And knight g5. So, of course, there was queen b6 in the initial position to win that rook, but these kind of positions, the king on f6 in particular, the king is running out of squares and can be very vulnerable to that rook, knight, and those pawns.
But we're starting
Rook
to.
D7
So
is
Magnus
played.
checked his score sheet, so he's keeping track of how many times each position has been played.
Yeah, he's
But
looking at.
it's
Well, I mean,
difficult to keep
he thinks-
track.
I was going to say he's keeping track of something, but it's very difficult to keep track of the repetition of a position because remember the rule is you don't have to repeat the same position 3 moves in a row. As long as the same position occurs, it could be 100 moves separating them in theory. Not likely, but in theory.
But at least he knows that that is a possibility, so he's
Yeah, he's looking at it right now.
trying to keep track of it. At some point, he's going to have to make a decision.
Yep. Jan is not so sure.
Okay, so
what
rook
Magnus will do
d2.
to try to shake things up.
He can play knight d2, but looks a bit. Although it makes sense because then you kind of push e4. Okay, but he plays rook d2.
We've seen this position before.
But was the queen on b2, right? That's the question. Where's the queen been? If
It might have been on a2, right?
right, but is queen b1? Is that the third time in this position after rook d2, queen b1? I'm not sure.
That's why they have an arbiter on site keeping track of this stuff.
Well, we can see actually on move 91. If you go there for a second, rook
Okay.
d2,
It
queen,
was on A2.
queen b1. No, but the queen went to b1.
Yeah,
But
So-
the king was on g7
Oh,
there.
and the key's in f6.
yeah.
Yeah.
Has to be the exact same position. So Magnus might be checking little details like that. If they haven't already gotten them a second score sheet, I'm sure that they will soon.
I think he's more frustrated that he can't find an idea to make progress.
Yeah.
Rook to e2 would be nice, but queen to b6.
Yeah,
I don't see.
We saw that position
Yeah.
earlier, right?
I don't see how he's pushing that pawn ahead. Maybe that e4, that crazy stuff that I mentioned was some sort of chance, but it's really tough to play like that.
Right. To just jettison the g3 pawn, run your king up.
Yeah.
But it did feel like, White can never really lose these positions.
No, White wasn't going to lose that one, but you're still worried that you blunder a fork of rook and king to the queen, and at this stage of the game when they've been playing for so long and such a difficult game, like this was not a game where Magnus has been trying to nurse an advantage the whole time. He's been close to losing. He's been objectively winning. They're exhausted.
Knight g1. He retreats the knight back.
Oh, he wants to play rook e2, e4, king on g2. He actually forces through e4 in that case.
That's actually really interesting. The knight on g1
This is
will
nice.
guard the e2 rook. With the king on g2, you can finally push the pawn.
Yeah, or you can
Jan-
put the king on h2.
Jan gave us a look there saying, okay, I see.
But what if after White goes rook e2, Black just brings the queen right back to e4?
That's actually really irritating.
Yep.
Yeah, that that stops everything. The point, yeah. If the knight is on f3, then the queen is not sitting on e4 because of what the knight has been doing.
But then with the queen on e4 and rook on e2,
Yes.
your queen can't move again, so I go back to f3.
So what I talked about earlier.
I kick the queen away with some knight move.
And then you bring your knight back to f3. So
Yeah, let's have a look at that.
This is a very direct play.
So
queen e4.
Queen e4 here.
Rook e2.
Rook e2.
King
somewhere.
Well, that is a risk.
Yeah, you go back.
King f6.
F6.
Knight g5.
Mm-hmm.
Queen goes h1, and we go knight f3 back. So actually, I mentioned this line earlier.
You finally got yourself in a spot where you can play
go e4. And we're not claiming this is winning, and we see the evaluation bar isn't going crazy. But the point is that you need to play e4 at some point.
Yeah, you have to. One, so that it's not a draw by 50 moves or threefold repetition.
And knight g1 means we will not get a threefold repetition because the knight has never been on g1. And Magnus wants to play e4. That's the two things it shows. The question is, after he gets e4, can he make progress after that? It is objective. Did he play rook to d1?
He did play rook d1 after queen to b4. So,
well, there he is surprising us again. Because yeah, I wonder why he didn't go rook e2. Maybe he doesn't want to play e4. Maybe he thinks that's just a drawn position.
Well, is he going to get f5 at some point? I mean, otherwise,
he has to do something.
Where's he going with this?
So give a check.
Queen b3, threw in a check. Maybe he wants e4, but only when the black king is in a certain spot.
Maybe here, king g7, e4 he wants?
And if
but then queen c2. Then queen c2. Yeah, if he keeps shuffling, of course, at some point, the position will repeat 3 times.
Where's he going with this? Yeah, I liked your plan earlier, though. The e4 and the king running in, that felt like White's chance.
It was an idea. I mean, it's almost certainly a draw there, but Magnus looks like he no longer has so much hope that he has serious winning chances here.
But he's concentrating, he's locked in. He's hoping that Jan puts his king on a square that could be vulnerable to a knight fork or just allow e4 to be punched through with stronger effect. But Jan is doing well on the clock. That's really important here. And he has more time. Yep. They get 30 seconds added to their clock with every move they make. So they can build up their clock. And Jan is doing very well to stay ahead. He does not want to be down under a minute. And then there's e4 happens and he has to make a critical choice with not enough time remaining. So here he's smart to, king g7.
Yep.
Right? Just to hide the king away, not be in the path of a knight fork. Once the knight comes back to f3, there's no knight f5, knight g5, things like that. But I just don't know where. Can Magnus maybe play rook d4, knight e2, pawn e4 in that manner? Because that blocks checks in the diagonal.
Yeah, that makes sense. The rook on d4, knight on e2 makes perfect sense.
Oh, maybe that's what he's going for.
Well, did he? He played rook d4. Okay, so
here we go.
We understand his idea. Knight e2 and e4 will.
It's an interesting one. The reason I like it is because the knight on e2 not only guards the rook, it guards g3
and
f4, making any sort of crazy tactics to blow this thing open less effective.
Yeah. I think this is a great idea because also, let's say if White plays queen b1, knight e2, queen h1, after e4, queen h2, not only is g3 pawn defended, after king e3, we saw that knight in previous variations, it defends the king against any checks. So there's no queen g1, there's no queen c1, there's no checks. And then White will happily push f5. Mm-hmm. The question becomes, after h4, let's say that we see a trade of h and g pawns,
okay.
Will White have serious winning chances there? Or will the king still be a bit vulnerable?
I think in that position, you'd want your pawn back on e3, which is kind of
it's funny. And it's one of the reasons Magnus has been so patient here. Once you commit, there's no going back, right? So he really wants to be sure that his knight, his rook, his king are all in their ideal setups for the rush.
But there is also something to note that if like knight e2 happens and White can play f5 and put the rook on f4, that's very dangerous because you're going to push the pawn as far as you can.
Yeah.
And if the king tries to blockade the pawn, if your knight can free up for some checks, that's also a worry. Of course, if your knight starts going in for checks, your king is susceptible to checks against the black queen. So it's not that clear cut, but that's one of the ideas that Magnus can keep in his back
That's a
pocket.
good point. We'll analyze that real quick. Like if, let's just show if like the king went to g6 and the knight went to e2 and the king went back, as long as there's no check on c2, hitting the king and picking up the pawn, f5 is an idea.
Yeah, e4,
f5,
F5,
you
rook
swing
F4,
the
yeah.
rook here, and suddenly f6 is coming. There's no h4.
The problem is your knight can't get in the game so easily because once the king sits on f6, you need your knight to get to e4 or something like that. But as soon as your knight leaves, there are a bunch of checks. So I think that
we have queen b2 check, and knight e2, and queen to b1, all on the board.
Yeah, maybe Jan is showing his intention to play e4, queen h1, and to trade those g and h pawns.
Yep. The problem also with the knight on e2, even though we liked it for all the defensive reasons of the pawns, Robert, is the knight on f3 is the best one to defend the king from checks.
right.
Now the threat of queen to h1 from Jan is renewed.
Well, with the king on e3, though, it is completely covered from checks.
Okay, that's fair, yeah.
So let's say e4, queen to h1. I think white would love to get rook d5 and king e3 as one move here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not possible.
Well,
maybe
what's
you play
what's
king
your
e3
check?
anyway.
So what if we start with
Yeah.
rook after queen b1? What if we start with rook d5?
Or are we going back to the previous stuff?
I'm going to go queen
Queen to
h1.
h1, and how are you pushing e4 now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can play rook e5. And
No, but
e4,
I like this idea of e4 and then king e3.
King e3 I like. h4. Take, maybe black gives a check on h3 first. King
Right.
d2, queen h4.
But this is here we go. I
Yeah.
mean, we're,
It's
there's no
hard to
going
say.
back now, right? Last game of the year, Dan. Don't hold anything back.
It's the same scenario where the knight needs to help out so you can push the pawns.
Yeah.
But as soon as the knight leaves, there's a
Yep.
bunch of checks the queen will get.
Yep.
So,
This is.
and here goes e4.
Oh, okay. We have action. The pawn has released the Kraken. Release the Kraken.
And that restarts the 50 move counter.
Yep.
So they don't have to worry about 3-time repetition. They don't have to worry about 50 moves that are capture or
Yep.
pawn push. And that means we almost certainly are going to break the world championship record for longest ever game.
That was move 110 for those who just tuned in. The longest game in World Chess Championship history was Korchnoi-Karpov 1974 at 124 moves. I'm going to call it. We will be breaking 1978. I apologies. Correction. I apologies. Has it been a long day or what?
It's been a long game.
Shout out to all those who woke up with us at 2 a.m. on the West Coast, huh?
All three of them.
All 5 of the viewers, all 3 of the people.
Wake up may be a strong word for
Yeah.
people who are up at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
watching. They may have just had a long night.
All right. Well, e4 played, and did Jan move? Because it looks like Magnus is thinking here.
Wait, did
Yeah,
he?
so-
Oh, okay, so e4 was played. Sorry, queen h1 and rook
He's giving
e7
a check.
check.
Makes sense. The king has to make a choice. Does it go? If it goes forward, suddenly there's checks. I don't think it wants to go forward, so maybe it just goes to the back rank. Let's say to g8, because if king f6, e5, I'm starting to get a bit worried about that king.
Right.
If it goes to g6, f5, same story.
And I really wish that knight could go to f5 and the king could just run into the middle, right?
Yeah.
Your plan from earlier. With the knight e2, that's
It's
not
a
good- it's not
great
good.
defensive piece,
Right.
but not a great attacking
Right.
piece.
Knights struggle to turn from a defender into an offensive piece. But Jan, goes back to g8, which makes sense considering what you were saying. No pawn pushes with check. But now we can start thinking about some pawn pushes to e5 and
But
some
I'm
mating
a
hand.
bit concerned. e5, h4. That rook on d7 is hanging.
Oh, because the rook is
Yeah.
loose there.
For
So
example, if king g8, e5, h4, if white, let's try the move e5, or
he goes rook back to d4,
Yeah.
so he's just
so he's repeating. Black can play h4 immediately or repeat the position with king to g7.
You should probably play tickle here. No reason to play h4.
unless he feels that h4 immediately secures him in the half point, that he feels like he has enough play against the pawns and the pieces, but Magnus can keep playing this. Why not?
Queen h2 was a bit funny because the king's better on e3.
Yeah, you actually force the king where he wants to go. Probably should have just played h4
And
first.
rook d5 now becomes a pretty serious idea.
I think at some point here we have to see h4.
Well, and look at, actually this line might not work. I was going to say if king g7 here, like rook d5, and if h4, sometimes you play rook h5. But the thing is, h3 might turn this around where if you are to lose,
Now
to win,
who's-
you lose.
Now who's better?
Yeah, not white anymore.
Well, then we have the weird question of knight and 3 pawns against queen.
Knight and 3 pawns versus queen is a question? No, I'm actually asking.
I've never seen that in game before. I guess the queen wins, but
Yeah, I don't know, probably.
probably.
But okay, we're seeing.
We're not 100% sure. The knight on f5 and the king on e3, it's difficult to break down.
Okay, h4 has been played. H4 has been played along with the. We looked at this exact line. King d2 will come.
We saw it with the king on g7. It's a slightly worse version for black here, but essentially shouldn't change very much
Right.
with the king on g8. White might play e5 here. That looks very sensible. And after e5, white might already be threatening f5 because the rook goes behind the f pawn. And then, as Robert said, that those pawns start to get moving. That could be dangerous.
And he goes,
I like that move, rook d3.
oh, I also like that move.
That's a great move.
You just say, your turn.
Yep.
I'm not committing. And the rook can go behind e3, maybe goes to f3, can also go to g3. I mean, white can choose.
We are in possibly table-based territory.
Yeah, I was gonna say we might
7 pieces.
actually have an answer.
We do. Wow,
So- This is a draw.
yeah.
Well, that's
not
not too surprising.
Okay.
Only moves which blunder the queen immediately lose.
Yeah, I was saying I see options that lose, right? But they're all queen g4 walking into a pan,
For
giving up your queen.
For those watching, all moderators, please share a link to the direct game on chess.com. And if you click the table-based tab in the upper right, you can actually see the answer to the position. We can't actually show it in front of you because it would cover Magnus's beautiful face in our show. We're not going to do that. But if you click the table-based tab in the upper right, you can actually see the forced, and if somebody is to make a mistake and blow it, you'll be able to see it in real time, that it is no longer a draw. But according to the table-based, black should be able to draw this ending.
But a table-based draw doesn't mean a human draw.
Not at all. Not at all. A table-based draw. You heard the doubt when you said we should check table-based. I was actually shocked that it was a draw.
Oh, no, I thought that this should be a draw, but at the same time, Fabiano made this point a long, long time ago in a land far away, where you can make a move just with your hand rather than with your brain. You move your queen across the board. The difference between b6 and a6 looks nothing, and then one move loses and the other holds. So Magnus is going to continue pressing. Look at his pieces. The knight, the rook, the pawns, the king, they're all nice and compact here. So if he can limit the checks that the black queen can give, maybe then he can push his pawns. And we see Magnus is giving this his all. Both players are. And they're coming out the rest day.
Yep.
I think they might need another rest day tomorrow. They're not getting one, but they probably need one.
They probably need it. Let's keep going. We're gonna stay right in here, the live view.
And it looks like Jan brought his queen back to its starting square with check. And he does get a bunch of checks. That's the good news for Jan if the king tries to come back towards the center. And it looks like Magnus is doing that. The queen can go diagonally to b6 square and give another check. So,
but white can cover that check very comfortably with knight to d4. And white's goal is knight d4, e5, king e4. You want to move that king up with the protection of pieces around it, pieces and pawns. And if you eventually get your king to f5, then when black gives a check,
You can play
white
six and
white can give can cover with a counter check. So that's the goal for white. It's of course a very long and slow process. If white wants to try for a win, there's no immediate sort of threats white can make. Well, I guess knight d4 isn't an immediate threat to the
to fork.
But